When my supervisor offered me triple pay for an off-the-books assignment, I should have hung up the phone. Instead, I drove deep into a restricted sector of the forest with a team of rangers and a terrified government agent to man a steel trap designed for a nightmare. We thought we were the hunters, but when the sun went down and the rocks started flying, we realized we were the bait in a war we didn't understand. I signed a non-disclosure agreement to keep my mouth shut, but after seeing the intelligence in those eyes, I can't stay silent anymore. Before I reveal the classified details of what really lives in the closed zones, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you want to hear more true encounters from the deep woods, hit that subscribe button. This is the story the government doesn't want you to hear. I have been a park ranger for 15 years, wearing the green and gray uniform with a pride that has slowly eroded into exhaustion. I know every trail, every drainage, and every migration pattern in my district better than I know the lines on my own hand. My life is defined by the rhythm of the seasons, the predictable stupidity of tourists feeding bears, and the quiet satisfaction of keeping the wild places wild. I thought I had seen everything the forest could throw at a man, from flash floods to armed poachers. But comfort is a dangerous thing. It makes you blind to the edges of the map where the rules stop applying and the shadows get deeper. By late September, the tourist money dries up, and the harsh reality of a ranger's salary sets in like the coming winter frost. My Ford pickup was sitting in the driveway with a blown transmission, a $3,000 paperweight I couldn't afford to fix. Worse than that was the acceptance letter on the fridge. My daughter, Sarah, got into her dream college, and the first tuition payment was due in October. I was drowning in the kind of quiet, blue-collar desperation that keeps you awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling and wondering which bill to skip. It puts a man in a position to say yes to things he should definitely say no to. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was finishing my second cup of coffee. It was my supervisor, Bob, but his voice lacked its usual jovial cadence. He sounded tight, clipped, and strictly official. "James," he said, skipping the pleasantries entirely, "I have a request from Regional. They need a senior ranger for a special detail. It's off the books, short-term, high risk." He didn't ask how I was doing or how the fishing was. He just threw the bait in the water and waited for the hunger to do the rest. The tone of his voice made the hair on my arm stand up. I started to ask the standard questions: where, what, and how long. But Bob cut me off before I could get the words out. "I can't tell you the specifics over the phone," he said, his voice dropping a decibel. "What I can tell you is that it pays triple your hourly rate, plus a significant hazard bonus paid in cash upon completion. Triple pay." I did the math in my head. 1 week of this would fix the truck, cover Sarah's first semester, and put food on the table. The red flags were waving frantically in my mind, warning me away, but the dollar signs were blocking my view. "I'm in," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could talk myself out of it. Bob gave me coordinates for a rendezvous point at an old disused fire station on the edge of the district and told me to be there at 0500 hours sharp. "Bring your heavy gear," he added, sounding almost apologetic. "And James, don't tell anyone where you're going, not even your wife." This strictly never happened. The line went dead, leaving me standing in my kitchen with a sinking feeling that I had just signed a contract I couldn't read. The next morning was cold, a heavy mist clinging to the valley floor as I pulled into the station lot. I wasn't the only one. 3 other men were standing by their vehicles, smoking cigarettes and looking grim in the dawn light. I recognized them vaguely. Hardened lifers from neighboring districts, the kind of guys you call when a hiker goes missing in a blizzard and you need bodies retrieved. We nodded to each other, the universal greeting of men who know the job, but nobody spoke. We were all wondering the same thing. Why did they need the heavy hitters for a routine assignment? A black, heavy-duty pickup truck with government plates and tinted windows idled in the center of the lot, looking out of place against the peeling paint of the station. Standing next to it was a man who looked completely wrong for the setting. A guy in a cheap suit and dress shoes, shivering violently in the mountain air. He checked a clipboard as we approached, avoiding eye contact like we were contagious. He didn't look like a Fed or a Black Ops guy. He looked like an accountant who had just witnessed a murder. He gestured for us to load our gear into the bed and get in without a word. We piled into the cab, the 4 of us rangers squeezed into the back and passenger seats with the suit driving. He drove us out of town and onto a network of service roads that hadn't seen a grader in years, heading deep into a sector of the forest that appeared as a blank green mass on most maps. We climbed higher into the backcountry, passing signs that said "Road closed" and "Federal property, no trespassing." The trees grew thicker, the light dimmer, and the radio chatter died away until there was only the sound of gravel crunching under the tires and the engine straining against the incline. We had been driving for 40 minutes when the tension in the cab became suffocating. The man in the suit was sweating profusely, beads of perspiration rolling down his temple despite the heater being off. He kept checking the rear-view mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, as if he expected something to come charging out of the timber behind us to drag him away. He wasn't just nervous, he was terrified. The smell of his fear, acrid, metallic, and undeniable, filled the small space, making us all shift uncomfortably in our seats. Finally, he turned around in the driver's seat while navigating a hairpin turn, his eyes wide and bloodshot, looking at us with desperation. "Listen to me," he stammered, his voice trembling. "You guys are getting paid a lot of money today, more than you've ever seen." He swallowed hard, his gaze darting to the dark forest rushing by outside the window. "That money is for your silence. Whatever you see out here, whatever happens, it stays here. If you can't handle that, tell me now." Nobody said a word. We just looked at the terror in his face and wondered what could possibly scare a government man this badly in the middle of the day. We drove for another hour, the road deteriorating into a washed-out logging track that rattled my teeth and threw us against the doors. Just as my nausea was peaking, the trees opened up into a staging area that had been carved out of the wilderness with brutal efficiency. We weren't the only ones there. 3 other identical black trucks were parked in a semicircle, and a group of grim-faced men were already standing around smoking. I did a quick head count as we piled out, 15 of us in total, a mix of rangers, private contractors, and trackers. We were a small army, but looking at the surrounding wall of dense, dark timber, I felt dangerously exposed. The man in the suit, who was now sweating through his shirt despite the chill, spread a series of topographic maps on the hood of his truck. He didn't introduce himself or anyone else. He just pointed a shaking finger at a red circle deep in the unmapped sector. "We are here," he said, his voice thin. "The target zone is 8 miles in, straight up that ridge. No vehicles can make it. We hike in, set up a base camp, and lay the containment grid." He spoke in euphemisms: containment, target, asset. But the way his eyes darted around the clearing told me he was talking about something that could look back. Then came the gear. We started unloading the heavy wooden crates from the truck beds, and the sound of metal clanking against metal echoed ominously. When we pried the first lid open, the air left my lungs. These weren't standard snares or tranquilizer rifles. They were steel jaw traps, but on a scale that defied logic. They were easily 3 feet across, with serrated teeth 6 inches long, and springs that looked like vehicle suspension coils. A bear trap is designed to hold a leg. These were designed to crush bone and sever muscle. "What the hell are we hunting?" the ranger next to me whispered, his face draining of color. "A T-Rex?" I looked at the chains attached to the traps. They were heavy-gauge industrial steel, the kind used for towing logging trucks, welded to anchor spikes that looked like harpoons. Whatever we were trying to catch wasn't just big, it was immensely powerful. My experience with wildlife management told me there was no animal in North America that required this level of hardware. A grizzly would be cut in half by these jaws, a moose would be snapped like a twig. These tools were built for a nightmare, something with the mass of a truck and the aggression of a demon. The breaking point happened before we even shouldered our packs. 2 of the local trackers, men who had spent their lives in these mountains, wandered to the edge of the clearing to relieve themselves. A moment later, one of them shouted, not a warning, but a sound of pure disbelief. We rushed over to find them staring at a patch of mud near the tree line. Pressed deep into the clay was a single footprint. It was 18 inches long, twice the width of my boot, and terrifyingly distinct. It had 5 toes, but the arch was wrong, the heel was too wide, and the weight distribution suggested a bipedal creature weighing nearly 1,000 pounds. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush us. We all knew what we were looking at, but nobody wanted to say the word. It was the physical manifestation of every campfire ghost story we had ever laughed off. The 2 trackers looked at the print, then at the suit, and dropped their gear right there in the mud. "No amount of money is worth this," one of them said, his voice trembling. "My grandfather told me about these things. You don't hunt them, you run." They walked back to their personal vehicle and drove away without looking back, leaving 13 of us standing over the impossible evidence. The suit man didn't try to stop them, he just looked more desperate. "Double the bonus for the rest of you," he stammered, looking at the sun dipping lower. "We have to move, now." Greed and professional pride are powerful drugs, so we stayed. We hoisted the heavy traps in our packs, forming a column that looked more like a chain gang than a ranger team, and marched into the tree line. The moment we crossed the threshold of the forest, the atmosphere shifted. The wind died, the birds stopped singing, and the air grew stagnant and heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We hiked for hours through terrain that fought us every step of the way, climbing over deadfall and hacking through briars that seemed to reach for us. But it was the silence that gnawed at my nerves. A healthy forest is noisy, squirrels chattering, jays scolding, branches snapping. This woods was dead quiet, a vacuum where sound went to die. It was the silence of a predator's living room. We weren't walking through wilderness. We were walking through a territory that had been cleared of competition. 4 miles in, we found the first sign that we weren't alone. Hanging from a branch about 8 feet off the ground was a shredded piece of bright orange nylon. It was the remains of a high-end camping tent, torn apart with a violence that made me nauseous. The fabric hadn't been cut. It had been pulled apart by brute strength. I looked up and saw dark stains on the bark of the tree, 9 feet up, splatters of old, dried blood. Whatever had destroyed the camp hadn't just killed the occupants. It had tossed them around like rag dolls. The smell hit us a mile later, a wave of musk that was so pungent it made my eyes water. It smelled like a mixture of wet dog, sulfur, and rotting meat, a biological warning sign that triggered a primal alarm in my hindbrain. We were walking straight into a lair. I looked at the men around me, seasoned professionals who had faced down cougars and forest fires, and saw the same look in every pair of eyes. The realization that we had crossed a line on the map that should never be crossed. We weren't the hunters anymore. We were the bait. We established our base camp in a clearing that felt less like a tactical position and more like a serving platter. The man in the suit insisted on this specific location, claiming it was central to the migration paths, but to any ranger with a grain of sense, it was a death trap. We were exposed on all sides, surrounded by a dense wall of old-growth timber that offered 1,000 hiding spots for anything watching us. We set up our tents in a tight circle, facing outward, but nobody was sleeping. We just sat on our coolers, gripping our rifles, watching the shadows lengthen and trying to ignore the feeling of eyes boring into the backs of our necks. The real work began at noon. We hauled the massive steel traps into the forest, moving toward the game trails the suit had identified on his map. When we found them, my blood ran cold. These weren't deer paths or elk runs. They were highways. The earth was packed down hard on a track that was 8 feet wide, bulldozed through the undergrowth with a purposeful force. Branches as thick as my arm were snapped off at my head height, leaving a tunnel that allowed something massive to move through the woods without slowing down. We spent 3 hours setting the 6 traps, digging shallow pits to conceal the metal jaws and covering them with leaves and dirt. It took 2 men just to set the tension springs, using a specialized winch system to crank the jaws open. I looked at the 6-inch steel teeth, gleaming in the dappled light, and felt a wave of nausea. We were laying landmines for a biological tank. We chained the traps to the bases of massive oak trees, using padlocks that looked like they belonged on a bank vault, ensuring that whatever we caught couldn't drag the trap or the tree away with it. As we worked, the forest began to reveal secrets that terrified me more than the footprints. Carved deep into the bark of a cedar tree near the second trap was a symbol, a crude, jagged shape that looked like a lightning bolt inside a circle. It wasn't random scratching, it was deliberate iconography. Nearby, on a large gray boulder, we found 3 parallel lines etched into the stone, fresh enough that rock dust still clung to the grooves. We weren't hunting a wild animal. We were invading the territory of something that used symbols to mark its borders. The tension broke late in the afternoon. We had just finished camouflaging the last trap, and were hiking back to the perimeter, when a sound erupted from the ridge above us that stopped my heart. It wasn't a roar, and it wasn't a scream. It was the unholy mixture of both, a volume of sound that vibrated my ribcage. It started as a guttural sub-bass growl and escalated into a high-pitched, shriek-like wail that sounded terrifyingly human. It was a sound of pure rage, followed immediately by the sickening crunch of metal snapping shut and the violent thrashing of heavy chains. "Contact!" the lead tracker screamed, though the warning was unnecessary. We sprinted back toward the noise, our boots slipping on the pine needles, adrenaline flooding our systems. The forest ahead of us was shaking, literally shaking. Saplings were being whipped back and forth, and the sound of branches snapping like gunshots echoed through the valley. As we crested the small rise leading to the trap site, the smell hit us first, that overpowering stench of musk and rot, followed by a visual that my brain refused to process. Caught in the third trap, thrashing with a power that defied physics, was a creature that made the grizzlies I'd handled look like house cats. It stood on one leg, the other clamped firmly in the steel jaws, towering between 8 and 9 feet tall. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, easily 4 feet across, tapering down to a waist that was pure muscle. It was covered in dark, matted brown fur that shimmered with a greasy sheen, shedding rain and dirt. Its arms were disproportionately long, reaching past its knees, ending in hands the size of catcher's mitts with thick black nails that clawed at the air. The creature lunged at us as we entered the clearing, the heavy chain snapping taut and arresting its movement with a jar that shook the ground. It didn't make a sound of pain, it made a sound of fury. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as it gripped the steel jaws of the trap with its free hands. The biceps under the fur bulged like cantaloupes as it pulled, the metal groaning under the strain. It was testing the trap, analyzing the mechanism, looking for the release latch. This wasn't panic. This was problem-solving under duress. Then it stopped fighting. It went completely still, dropping its arms and turning its head to look at us. That was the moment the true horror set in. The face wasn't the muzzle of a bear or the flat face of an ape. It was a terrifying intermediate. A heavy protruding brow ridge shading deep-set eyes, a wide flat nose, and a powerful jaw that jutted forward. But the eyes were intelligent. They were a piercing amber color, and they didn't hold the wild, confused panic of an animal. They held a cold, calculating hatred. It scanned the line of 13 rangers, looking each of us in the face, memorizing our features. It wasn't looking for an escape route anymore. It was looking for enemies. It locked eyes with me, and I felt a primal shiver run down my spine. A genetic memory of being prey. It bared its teeth, square, yellow, and human-like but massive, and let out a low, vibrating hiss. It knew we had done this. It knew we were the trap makers. And in that look, I realized that we hadn't just caught a monster. We had declared war on a person. The lead ranger, a veteran named Miller who had taken down rogue bison in Yellowstone, stepped forward with the tranquilizer rifle. He wasn't using standard darts. He was loaded with a ketamine mixture designed to drop a 1,000-pound grizzly in 30 seconds. He took a knee, aimed for the thick muscle of the creature's thigh to avoid hitting a bone or an artery, and fired. The thwump of the air compression was followed instantly by the bright pink tuft of the dart burying itself in the creature's fur. We waited for the stagger, the glazed look, the collapse. Instead, the creature looked down at the dart with an expression of annoyance rather than pain. With a dexterity that was terrifying to watch, it reached down, plucked the dart from its leg using 2 fingers, and threw it back at Miller. It didn't just drop it. It hurled it with enough velocity that it snapped a sapling next to Miller's head. The drug hadn't even had time to deploy before the creature rejected it. It roared again, straining against the chains, realizing that we were trying to take it alive. Miller racked the bolt and fired again, and again. It took 4 darts, a chemical payload that would have stopped the heart of an African elephant, before the creature finally began to slow. Its movements became heavy and fluid, like it was moving underwater, and its roars subsided into low, guttural moans. But it never fully lost consciousness. It slumped against the tree, its head lolling, but those amber eyes remained open, tracking our movements with a drugged, hateful sluggishness. It was paralyzed, but it was present. The suit man rushed forward, screaming at us to secure the asset. It took all 13 of us to move it. We threw a heavy canvas tarp over its head to block its vision, though I could feel its gaze burning through the fabric. When we tried to lift it, the density of the creature shocked me. It wasn't just fat and fur. It was like trying to lift a statue made of lead and iron. It easily weighed 600 pounds, but it felt heavier. A dense, compact mass of muscle that strained our backs and tested the limits of the transport cart we had brought. As we secured the creature to the cart, I was tasked with removing the steel trap from its leg. I expected to see a mangled ruin of flesh and shattered bone. The trap had a crushing force of nearly 1,000 psi. We used the winch to pry the jaws open, and I peeled back the matted, bloodied fur to inspect the damage. My stomach turned, not from gore, but from the lack of it. The skin was cut, and there was massive bruising, but the leg was intact. The bone hadn't snapped. The structural density required to withstand that kind of pressure without fracturing was biologically impossible for any known terrestrial animal. We wrapped the creature in chains that the suit man provided, heavy industrial links that were clearly manufactured for this specific purpose. We bound its wrists and ankles, then wrapped the chains around its chest and the cart itself. Even in its sedated state, the creature's muscles twitched and rippled under the bindings, testing the tension. It was a terrifying process, like tying down a hurricane. Every time I touched it, I felt a low vibration humming through its body, a constant subsonic growl that I felt in my teeth more than I heard with my ears. The hike back to base camp was a nightmare of mud, sweat, and paranoia. We dragged the cart over roots and rocks, constantly checking the trees for movement. The forest felt even quieter now, if that was possible, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath in horror at what we had done. When we finally reached the clearing, we found that the suit man had been busy. He had assembled a cage in the center of the camp, a prefab structure of reinforced steel bars and heavy locking mechanisms that had come out of the crates. We hoisted the creature into the cage, removing the tarp but leaving the chains on. It slumped in the corner, a massive, dark shape that filled the enclosure. The suit man was frantic, pacing around the cage, checking the locks and talking into a satellite phone in hushed, urgent tones. "Package secured," he whispered. "Extraction team needed ASAP. The dosage is holding, but yeah, it's big. Bigger than the last one." The last one. The words hung in the air, confirming that this wasn't an anomaly. This was a program. Night fell like a hammer, plunging the camp into absolute darkness. We set up perimeter lights, flooding the clearing with harsh halogen beams, but the light only seemed to make the surrounding forest darker. We didn't make a fire. Nobody wanted to illuminate themselves. We stood in the shadows, weapons drawn, watching the cage. The creature began to stir more as the drugs wore off, pulling at the chains, testing the bars with a silent, methodical strength. It wasn't roaring anymore. It was waiting. Around 300 hours, the silence broke. A perimeter alarm on the north side of the camp, a tripwire connected to a flare, didn't just trip, it was severed. Then the west sensor died, then the south. We were being probed. From the darkness beyond the lights, a sound emerged. A low, rhythmic whoop, whoop, whoop that echoed from 3 different directions. It wasn't the call of a coyote or an owl. It was a signal. The creature in the cage lifted its head and answered with a deep, booming knock of its knuckles against the metal floor. They weren't just circling us. They were coordinating a rescue. The first volley didn't come with a warning roar. It came with the terrifying whoomp of displacement as a rock the size of a basketball slammed into the hood of the suit man's truck. The metal buckled and screamed, the impact echoing like a gunshot in the valley. Before we could even dive for cover, the air was filled with the whistling sound of projectiles. Stones ranging from baseballs to river boulders rained down on the clearing from the darkness beyond the lights. This wasn't the random thrashing of an angry animal. It was a coordinated artillery barrage designed to suppress us. A massive rock struck the center of our fire pit, which we had kept low for warmth, scattering burning logs and embers across the camp. The sudden loss of that central light source plunged us into a chaotic strobe light nightmare, illuminated only by the erratic beams of our flashlights and the perimeter halogens. "Get down!" Miller screamed, dragging the suit man behind the wheel of the lead truck. We scrambled for cover behind the heavy equipment crates and the vehicles, huddled against the tires as the bombardment hammered the metal and dirt around us. The accuracy was unnerving. They weren't just throwing blindly into the clearing, they were targeting us. If a ranger popped his head up to scan the tree line, a rock would whiz inches past his helmet a second later. They were calculating trajectories in the dark, using their night vision superiority to keep us pinned. I watched a rock the size of a bowling ball smash into a crate of supplies not 3 feet from me, shattering the wood. The strength required to hurl that kind of weight 50 yards with that kind of precision was beyond comprehension. The physical assault was backed by a sophisticated psychological campaign. While the heavy hitters threw rocks from the north ridge, other creatures moved to the east and west, shaking the brush and unleashing blood-curdling screams. They were creating a surround sound theater of terror, making it sound like there were 50 of them circling us. They utilized noise discipline perfectly. One would scream, and as soon as we turned our weapons that way, another would hit the truck from the opposite side. They were turning our own reflexes against us, spinning us in circles until we were dizzy with panic. We fired a few warning shots into the air, the cracks of the rifles deafening in the enclosed valley. But it had zero effect. If anything, it made them more aggressive. They knew we couldn't see them. Every time a muzzle flashed, it just gave away our position, inviting a fresh wave of rocks. The creature in the cage was the conductor of this symphony. It would let out a low, resonant grunt, and the attack pattern would shift. It was communicating real-time tactical adjustments to the squad outside. We weren't fighting animals. We were fighting an extraction team. The siege lasted for hours, a grueling endurance test that frayed our nerves to the breaking point. The suit man was curled in a ball in the cab of the truck, sobbing quietly. The younger rangers were hyperventilating, their eyes wide and white in the darkness. I lay flat in the mud, listening to the heavy thuds of stone on steel, realizing that they could have overrun us at any moment. They weren't rushing in because they didn't want to get shot. They were softening us up, wearing us down, waiting for us to make a mistake or run out of ammo. Around 0400 hours, the assault stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The rocks ceased falling, the screaming died out, and the forest returned to that suffocating, heavy silence. It was almost worse than the noise. We lay there for another hour, fingers frozen on our triggers, waiting for the final charge that never came. The silence felt heavy with expectation, like a predator pausing before the bite. We knew they hadn't left. They were just watching, resting, waiting for the sun to change the variables of the battlefield. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the trees, the devastation of our camp was revealed. The trucks were dented and smashed, their windshields spiderwebbed with cracks. The ground was littered with hundreds of river stones that had been hauled up from the creek miles away. We looked like we had been caught in a landslide. We were exhausted, bruised, and morally broken. The creature in the cage sat quietly, watching us with a smug, patient expression. It knew it had won. Miller stood up, dusting the dirt off his uniform, and looked at the battered team. He walked over to the suit man who was trembling as he stepped out of the truck. Miller grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive jacket and shoved him against the door. "We are done," Miller said, his voice flat and non-negotiable. "We are leaving. Now." The suit tried to argue, babbling about the asset and the contract, but Miller pointed to the tree line. "Look at the spacing of those rocks. They bracketed us. They could have killed us 10 times over. These things aren't going to stop until they get their friend back," Miller continued, addressing the whole group. "There are more of them than us. They are smarter than we expected, better organized, and they know this territory better than we ever will." He looked at the cage, then at the dark woods. "We are retreating. If we try to hold this position another night, nobody walks out of here." The order was given. We began to break camp with the frantic energy of men fleeing a burning building, leaving the heavy gear behind, focused only on survival. We abandoned the site with a speed that bordered on panic, leaving the heavy equipment, the tents, and most importantly, the cage behind. Miller made the call that saving the asset wasn't worth losing 13 lives, a decision that nearly caused the suit man to have a stroke right there in the mud. He screamed about the millions of dollars in sunk costs, about the directive from headquarters, but Miller just shoved a rifle into his hands and told him to walk or stay behind and explain the budget to the locals. We formed a tight defensive diamond, weapons facing outward, and began the long, humiliating march back to the extraction point. For the first mile, the forest felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. We weren't alone. We could hear them moving parallel to us in the dense brush on both sides of the trail. They didn't try to hide their presence this time. We heard the heavy snap of branches, the thud of footfalls, and low, chirping whistles that passed information up and down their line. They were escorting us. It was a show of force, a disciplined guard detail ensuring that the intruders were actually leaving their territory. They could have ambushed us at any choke point, but they showed a restraint that was terrifyingly professional. The psychological weight of that walk was crushing. Every shadow looked like a monster. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a charge. I kept looking back, half expecting to see the massive shape of the Alpha charging down the trail. But they stayed just out of sight, a constant menacing pressure on our flanks. They were herding us like cattle, pushing us toward the boundary line of their domain. It was a humbling realization that we, the apex predators with our high-powered rifles, were being evicted by something that understood the terrain better than we ever would. We were about 2 miles out, halfway to the trucks, when the sound of the destruction reached us. It started with a metallic screeching, the sound of steel being torqued beyond its yield strength, that echoed through the valley behind us. Then came the heavy, rhythmic clang of the cage walls being battered, followed by the shattering of the structural supports. It sounded like a train derailment happening in slow motion. The escort team had waited until we were at a safe distance before circling back to free their kin. Then came the roar. It wasn't the roar of the trapped creature. It was a chorus. A massive, triumphant bellow erupted from the campsite, joined by 3 or 4 others. It was a sound of victory, of liberation, that chilled me to the bone. The creature was free. The cage we had built with reinforced steel and industrial locks had been torn apart like a cardboard box. The realization that they possessed the strength to dismantle our strongest containment measures in minutes made the rifle in my hand feel like a toy. We picked up the pace, moving from a fast walk to a desperate jog. When we finally burst out of the tree line and into the staging area, the relief was so intense I nearly vomited. The black trucks were waiting, engines idling, looking like hearses in the morning light. The suit man sprinted for the lead vehicle, fumbling with a satellite radio before he even opened the door. His demeanor had shifted from abject terror to a frantic bureaucratic panic. He wasn't worried about monsters anymore. He was worried about his bosses. I stood by the tailgate of the truck, gasping for air, and overheard snippets of his conversation. "Containment failure," he hissed into the handset, his voice shaking. "Asset unrecoverable. Team compromised. Initiating scrub protocol." He paused, listening to a voice on the other end that sounded angry. "No, sir." They coordinated. It was a siege. We were outmaneuvered. Asset recovery. Scrub protocol. The terminology confirmed that this wasn't a scientific expedition gone wrong. It was a failed military operation. The ride back to the station was a silent funeral procession. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked at each other. We stared out the windows as the dark forest receded, replaced by the mundane comfort of paved roads and telephone poles. I looked at my hands, still trembling with adrenaline, and tried to process the last 24 hours. I had seen things that defied biology, physics and sanity. I had looked into the eyes of a species that shouldn't exist and seen an intelligence that rivaled my own. And now I was being driven back to a world that would never believe me. When we arrived at the station, we weren't allowed to go to our cars. We were ushered into a conference room by men we had never seen before, men in gray suits who looked like they were carved out of ice. The debriefing lasted 6 hours. They didn't ask us if we saw anything. They asked specific tactical questions. How did they communicate? Did you see tool use? Estimate the grip strength. They were gathering data. They knew exactly what was out there. They just wanted to know how their latest attempt to catch it had failed. Then came the paperwork. They slid a stack of documents across the table that was thick enough to be a novel. It was an NDA, but it was weaponized. It stated that our mission was routine wildlife management involving a rogue bear. It threatened federal prison, loss of pension, and financial ruin for any breach of confidentiality. You saw a bear, Ranger Crawford, the gray suit said, staring at me with dead eyes. A big, sick bear. If you tell anyone otherwise, even your wife, we will bury you under so much litigation your grandchildren will be paying it off. I signed the paper. I took the envelope of cash, and I walked out into the parking lot. A richer man, but entirely hollowed out. The aftermath of the operation was handled with the same cold efficiency as the extraction. I was placed on immediate administrative leave, 2 weeks, fully paid, under the guise of trauma recovery following a bear encounter. Before I could even unpack my bags, a transfer order landed in my mailbox. I was being reassigned to a district 3 hours south, a place known for manicured picnic grounds and paved walking paths, far away from the deep backcountry. It wasn't a punishment, it was a quarantine. They wanted to separate the witnesses, scattering the 13 of us across the state so we couldn't compare notes or validate each other's nightmares over a beer. I checked my personnel file a week later, expecting to see a redacted black hole. Instead, I found a masterful piece of fiction. The official report listed the incident as routine wildlife management duties involving the tracking and relocation of a diseased grizzly bear. There was no mention of the traps, the siege, or the ruined equipment. The time logs had been altered, the location shifted by 20 miles, and the munitions count adjusted to reflect a standard tranquilizer usage. It was a perfect lie, boring enough to withstand scrutiny and detailed enough to satisfy any bureaucrat. My hazard pay was deposited as a performance bonus, sitting in my bank account like blood money. A month later, I drove back toward the old sector, not to work, but to see the lie in physical form. The main service road leading to the valley was gone, blocked by concrete jersey barriers and a heavy steel gate that looked new. A massive sign had been erected. Area closed. Dangerous soil instability. It was the perfect cover story. Unstable soil is a vague, unsexy danger that keeps hikers and geologists away without sparking curiosity. It implies landslides, not monsters. They had effectively annexed 100 square miles of public land, erasing it from the map under the pretense of public safety. The security was no longer being handled by the Forest Service. I saw private contractors in unmarked SUVs parked at the trailheads, men who wore sunglasses on cloudy days and carried sidearms on their hips. They weren't there to help tourists find the bathroom. They were there to turn people around. I watched a family in a station wagon get stopped at the checkpoint. The contractor didn't smile. He just pointed at the sign and waited for them to leave. The forest wasn't being preserved, it was being occupied. The government had drawn a perimeter around the unknown, turning the woods into a containment zone. Through unofficial channels, the whispers that traveled between fire lookouts and dispatchers, I heard about the specialists who were flowing into the closed zone. Convoys of white box trucks with government plates were seen heading up the logging roads at night. Rumors swirled about anthropologists from Ivy League universities and military tacticians being flown in on private charters. They weren't just containing the creatures, they were studying them. The focus had shifted from extermination to analysis. They wanted to know how a species could remain hidden for so long, how they organized, and, most terrifyingly, how they could be weaponized. The scale of the operation hinted at a truth I had suspected but never wanted to confirm. This wasn't a new discovery. You don't mobilize a response team like that overnight. The specialized traps, the containment protocols, the pre-written NDAs, it all pointed to a long-standing program. The government had known about these things for years, maybe decades. We hadn't stumbled onto a new species. We had stumbled into an ongoing secret war. The forest was just one front in a conflict that was being fought in the shadows of the national park system. I started going to a dive bar near the district line, a place where old rangers went to drink away the silence of the woods. After a few months, and a few too many whiskeys, I started hearing the stories. It's a subtle language, a nod, a look, a specific turn of phrase. I met a guy from the Pacific Northwest who talked about the hairy man, not as a myth, but as a logistical problem. He told me about a team in Oregon that specializes in rapid site cleanup after hikers go missing in certain valleys. We formed a quiet, terrified fraternity, bound together by the knowledge that the food chain doesn't end with us. The darkest rumors concerned the facilities. A ranger from Nevada told me about a black site in the high desert where the biological assets were taken if they were actually captured. He spoke in hushed tones about underground labs where they studied the density of the bones and the structure of the vocal cords. The idea made me sick. I remembered the intelligence in the eyes of the creature we had trapped, the way it had coordinated the rescue. If they had one of them in a cage somewhere, being poked and prodded, it wasn't science. It was torture of a sentient being, and if they ever escaped, God help us. I tried to settle into my new job at the picnic grounds, but the trauma was a stain that wouldn't wash out. Every time a branch snapped behind me, my hand went to my holster. Every time the woods went quiet, my heart hammered against my ribs. I couldn't look at the tree line without expecting a rock to come flying out. I was jumping at shadows, terrifying the tourists I was supposed to be helping. The wilderness wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a hostile entity that was watching me, remembering my face, waiting for me to step back over the line. 6 months after the incident, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked into my supervisor's office and requested a transfer, not just to another district, but to another biome. I asked for the desert, the coast, the plains, anywhere where the horizon was flat and there were no trees to hide a giant. I needed to be somewhere where I could see for miles, where nothing could sneak up on me. I packed my truck and drove away from the mountains without looking in the rearview mirror, thinking I could outrun the memory. But as I settled into a new life in the high desert, I realized that while I had left the woods, the secret had followed me home. 3 years have passed since I walked out of those woods, but the forest hasn't let me go. I live in Arizona now, surrounded by cactus and scrub brush, a landscape so flat you can see a coyote running away for 3 days. Yet, I still wake up at 3 a.m. drenched in cold sweat, the phantom sound of rattling chains and that sub-bass roar vibrating in my chest. My wife thinks it's job stress from the years of service. She doesn't know that I sleep with a loaded .45 on the nightstand, because I know that locks are just suggestions to the things I saw. The desert is quiet, but in my dreams, I'm always back in that suffocating, silent timber, waiting for the first rock to fly. Distance has given me perspective, and the pieces of the puzzle have finally clicked into a terrifying picture. That operation wasn't a botched first attempt. It was a routine maintenance cycle. The specialized traps, the custom-built transport cages, the scrub protocols. You don't develop that kind of infrastructure for a rumor. The government has been dealing with this wildlife issue for decades, possibly since the logging boom pushed us deeper into their territory. They treat these creatures not as scientific discoveries to be shared, but as a geopolitical secret, a biological nuclear weapon that needs to be contained. I was just a disposable contractor in a war that started before I was born. I still have contacts in the old district, buddies who didn't sign the NDAs because they weren't on the ground. They tell me that the closed zone has turned into a technological fortress. It's not just fences, it's a panopticon. They've laced the trees with motion sensors, thermal cameras, and seismic listening devices. The forest floor is wired like the DMZ between North and South Korea. They aren't just keeping people out. They are tracking every movement, every migration, building a database of behavior. They are studying the enemy, looking for patterns, trying to find a weakness in an organism that seems to have none. What keeps me up at night isn't their size. A bear is big, and we can handle bears. It's their mind. I think back to the siege, the way they used noise discipline, the way they bracketed our position with artillery, the way they waited for the psychological breaking point. They weren't just reacting, they were learning. They tested our defenses, identified the threat, and neutralized it with minimal casualties on their side. We were playing checkers while they were playing three-dimensional chess. They aren't wild animals. They are a rival intelligence sharing our planet, hiding in the blind spots of our arrogance. The scariest realization is that while we are studying them, they are studying us. Every interaction, every failed trap, every encounter teaches them something new about human technology and tactics. They know what guns are now. They know what cameras look like. They know that artificial lights mean danger. We are forcing them to evolve, to become more elusive and more aggressive. We are sharpening their instincts. If there is ever a full-scale conflict, if we push them too far into a corner, we aren't going to be fighting beasts. We'll be fighting an insurgent force that knows the terrain better than any satellite ever could. I look at the maps of human expansion, the suburbs eating into the foothills, the logging roads cutting deeper into the backcountry, and I see a collision course. We are shrinking their world every day. Eventually, the closed zones won't be enough. There will be a tipping point where they have nowhere left to retreat, and that's when the real violence will start. They are strong enough to tear steel, smart enough to plan ambushes, and numerous enough to hold a grudge. When they decide they've had enough of hiding, the hiking trails and the campgrounds are going to become hunting grounds. The logic of biology dictates that if there was a rescue party, there is a society. There are mothers, fathers, and young ones. They have a culture, a language, and a history. The government treats them as assets, but I saw a family rescuing a kidnapped member. That bond is powerful. If we kill one of them, we make enemies of them all. I wonder how many other containment zones exist across the Rockies, the Appalachians, the Pacific Northwest. How many missing persons cases are actually casualties of this silent war? The map is full of holes, and monsters live in every single one of them. I've spent my life telling people to enjoy nature, but now my advice is different. If you go deep into the woods, pay attention to the silence. If the birds stop singing, if the squirrels vanish, if the wind feels heavy, turn around. If you find a structure of sticks that looks too deliberate to be windfall, or a footprint that looks like a barefoot man the size of a giant, don't take a picture. Don't investigate. Leave. Run. You have entered a sovereign territory where you have no rights and no protection. You're being watched, likely from 10 feet away, by something that can snap your spine before you hear the twigs snap. And for God's sake, if you see one, pray it doesn't see you. Because I am convinced of one thing above all else. They remember faces. That creature in the trap memorized every one of us. I live 1,000 miles away, and I still check my rearview mirror. I still avoid the dark corners of my own yard. Once you are marked by that amber gaze, you never really feel safe again. They don't forget, and I don't think they forgive. We are the invaders, the loud, clumsy children breaking into their home, and one day, the parents are going to come home to discipline us. I am an old ranger now, retired and tired. I will take this secret to my grave, except for these anonymous words. I signed the papers, I took the blood money, and I bought my silence. But silence doesn't buy peace. I know what's out there. I know that the line between civilization and the primeval nightmare is razor thin, held up by a few rusted fences and a government cover-up. So go camping, enjoy the view, but remember, the woods don't belong to us. We are just guests, and we are overstaying our welcome. Keep your fire bright, keep your gun close, and never, ever go into the dark alone.